Welcome to YUUR Voice, a New Jersey public policy program of the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry of New Jersey. UULMNJ is dedicated to providing a voice of justice, equality, and compassion, and to raising the ethical and moral questions related to our state's social issues and legislative issues. My name is Reverend Craig Hirschberg. I am the Executive Director of UULMNJ and your host for this program. This series of educational programs will explore important social issues facing New Jersey, including economic justice, mass incarceration, environmental sustainability, immigration, and other important issues. Today, we are exploring mass incarceration, which is commonly known as the new Jim Crow. This term was coined by Michelle Alexander, who authored the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Color Blindness. Our guests today include Alexander Shalom, a senior staff attorney of the American Civil Liberties Union in New Jersey. And in that role, Alex litigates cases on issues that disproportionately affect people of color. He advocates both in and out of the courtroom throughout New Jersey on issues such as accountable police practices, just criminal systems, and living conditions for those incarcerated. Our second guest is attorney Roseanne Scotti. Roseanne is the New Jersey State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. She founded the Prevention Point Philadelphia Harm Reduction Law Project, providing free legal assistance for drug users and sex workers in Philadelphia. In 2014, she received an award for outstanding achievement in HIV prevention from the New Jersey HIV Prevention Community Planning Group. And moderating the panel today is Al Stawsky, our UULMNJ Ending the New Jim Crow Task Force Chair. Mr. Stawsky is a longtime racial and social justice activist. He has recently been involved in advocacy addressing discriminatory racial and economic practices in the criminal court system. Alex, Roseanne, and Al, thank you for being with us here today. We're excited to hear all you have to tell us. But Al, I know you have a lot of important questions you would like to give. So would you like to? I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Hirschberg. Roseanne Scotti, Alex, Shalom. It's a pleasure to see you. Let me add my thank you for joining us for this discussion today. There are many critical issues facing our society today that call for urgent action. These include immigration, economic inequality and poverty, voting rights, gun violence, to mention just a few. What makes criminal justice reform an issue? Why is it important? And what may its relation be to other issues?
Well, I would say what makes it important is its relation to all these other issues. Criminal justice reform, and in particular drug policy reform, impacts so many areas in terms of economic inequality, in terms of racial justice, in terms of the criminalization of pregnant women that we're seeing increasingly across the country, and in terms of voting rights. When you look today at so many, here in New Jersey, between 14 and 16% of African American men at any given time can't vote because they are on parole or probation. And this is one of the things that leads people to call the drug war and our current mass incarceration the new Jim Crow. So I think it is the intersection with all that makes it so important.
I think it's also the absolute magnitude of it, right? The United States has 5% of the world's population, yet a quarter of the world's incarcerated population. And that's 2.3 million people, but that's not just 2.3 million people's lives disrupted, that's 2.3 million families' lives thrown into turmoil, 2.3 million communities destroyed. And so it's the absolute scope of it. It's also the fact that it doesn't impact all Americans on the same level, right? You have people of color making up about 30% of the United States population, but 60% of the prison population. So there are all those reasons it matters. But also to reinforce Roseanne's point, Reverend King famously talked about when he was condemning the war in Vietnam, he said, the bombs dropped in Vietnam explode at home. And what that meant was money spent on the war in Vietnam was money not being spent on programs of social uplift. So every dollar we spend on mass incarceration is a dollar we're not spending on healthcare. It's a dollar we're not spending on education. It's a dollar we're not spending on job training.
You mentioned the question of the disproportionate targeting of people of color. The consequences of this have been named the new Jim Crow, as has been mentioned from this influential landmark book by Michelle Alexander. What are the consequences of this, and to what extent has this been happening?
Well, this has been one of the interesting things is that if you look at the rates of incarceration in this country for over the last 100 years, from the early 1900s, they were up until the 1970s flat. Our rates of incarceration were flat. We got to the mid-1970s and all of a sudden the rates of incarceration went off the charts. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened right at the time, at the height of the civil rights movement, when so many rights had been won, voting rights and access to economic opportunities and all these types of things. And then you saw this phenomenon of mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow come in and reverse a lot of those gains, particularly in poor communities of color. And so there is absolutely a connection to this, and it's gotten to the point where we have become infamous in terms of this around the world when people look at our rates of incarceration and the disproportionate impact it has on communities of color. This is something that in order to hold our heads up in this world, we need to fix.
Infamous is a good word to describe it.
I mean, again, the scope of it is huge even for white people. Every one in roughly 105 or so white people goes to prison, whereas 1 in every 18 African Americans is in prison right now. That's an astonishing fact. The fact that an African American male has a 1 in 3 chance of being in prison at some point in his lifetime is a mark of national shame.
Some claim that the disproportionate rates of imprisonment of people of color is the unfortunate result of higher crime and drug use rates among that population. How do you respond to those theories?
Well, that is, on its face, I would say laughable. We know from government study after government study that African Americans and Latinos and whites use drugs, for instance, at exactly the same rates. But the rate at which African Americans and Latinos are arrested, incarcerated, dwarfs the percentage of whites that are arrested, incarcerated. And so the disproportionate impact is not a result of more crime or more drug use. It's a result of our policing and our incarceration policies.
I actually take a position that I don't think we can ignore the fact that poverty and despair contribute to crime sometimes. But I think Roseanne hits the nail on the head by talking about drug use. So marijuana, that's like the easiest place to start. We know, and these aren't Drug Policy Alliance or ACLU figures, government study figures indicate that marijuana use among African Americans and white people is virtually identical and has been for decades now. But we know that if you're an African American in the United States, you're almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana use. We know that in New Jersey, you're 2.8 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana use. So what we see are these policing policies, things like stop and frisk, things like broken windows policing, that call for the hyper enforcement of low-level crimes like marijuana possession and like other crimes. And those aren't happening in Princeton or in Montclair or in other affluent places. They're happening in our urban centers, and they're happening in places that are disproportionately inhabited by people of color.
I understand the figure for drug use among African Americans is 13%, perhaps even as low as 12%, while the proportion of the population of African Americans is exactly the same. So that certainly doesn't explain why the proportion of those arrested is so high. You've spoken about the numbers of Americans in the prison system who are or have been incarcerated, and how that's grown usually since the victories of the civil rights movement. Why exactly has this happened, and what is the role of the war on drugs during this period? And what may the short and long-term effects be on individuals, families, communities, and society as a whole? You've already spoken to some extent about this. Is there anything more we can say about that and its impact on society as a whole?
Well, I don't think you can talk about mass incarceration in the United States with any credibility without starting and ending with the war on drugs. The war on crime has, by and large, been a war on drugs. And so to dismantle mass incarceration, you need to start by ending the war on drugs. I think all reasonable people who look at the system would agree with that. But that's not enough. Because in addition to this proliferation of incarceration based on this hyper-policing of drug use, what we've also seen is cynical politicians being elected on these tough-on-crime platforms, and these tough-on-crime platforms simply aren't compatible with my worldview, and I think the worldview of most Unitarian Universalists, which is to believe these things, this kind of lock them up and throw away the key philosophy. You have to believe that people are beyond redemption. You have to believe that people are defined by the worst thing that they've ever done. And that's not how I look at the world, and I don't think that's how a lot of people look at the world. And I think we need to start rolling back some of those harsh sentencing practices, policing practices, and so on.
And I think that's something that really goes, when you look at families, and you talked about the effect on families, children who have a parent incarcerated are many times more likely to end up being incarcerated themselves than children who don't have a parent incarcerated. People who have been incarcerated make over their lifetimes about 40% less in lifetime wages than people who haven't been incarcerated. And in poor communities where there is mass incarceration, in places like Newark, where there's such a high rate of people being arrested and put through the criminal justice system, that's money, that's lost money that would be supporting those families, supporting communities, paying taxes to the city, all the things that we need to have strong families and communities. So it directly impacts our families and communities in very real ways.
You can even say that the war on drugs is also the war for poverty.
Well, I would also say that the war on drugs isn't a war on drugs, it's a war on people.
Right, yes.
If I can interject here, I'm just curious. You mentioned, some of the things that we could be changing in our laws. Could you give us some examples for people who may not know what some of the real issues are of incarceration?
Well, Roseanne and I have both been working for the last, and as have you, Reverend Hirschberg, on bail reform in New Jersey. We were able to identify in the last several years that when people are arrested, they are either released or they go to jail. And this is not after they've been convicted. This is before they've been convicted. And you would think that the most dangerous people, the people most likely to flee, those are the people who would be in jail and the other people would be out. But that's not true. The Drug Policy Alliance commissioned a study, and we learned that when you have about 15,000 people in jail in New Jersey, almost 3/4 of them are pretrial detainees, meaning they've been convicted of nothing. And about half of them haven't been charged with a violent crime, haven't been charged with a weapons offense, and haven't been charged with a sex offense. They're simply put, they're not the dangerous people, they're the poor people. We know that there are more than 1,000 people in jail because they couldn't come up with $2,500 to get out. And so the recognition, TPA, ACLU, but also some strange bedfellows, Governor Christie, the Attorney General, the county prosecutors, the Office of the Public Defender, what everyone agreed is we need to transition from a system that makes determinations of release or incarceration based on resources, which is our current system, to a system that makes those determinations based on risk. And the Senate and the Assembly just passed bills that would do just that. We expect the governor to sign it imminently. And that's a real opportunity to reduce part of our problems with mass incarceration. It's not enough, and it's going to take some real hard work to implement it the right way, but that's certainly a step in the right direction. And that's actually something that's going to come to the voters in November. There's a constitutional amendment that its passage is required in order to effectuate this bill, and that'll come to the voters in November.
Can you explain why it's necessary to effect the bill?
So New Jersey's constitution since 1949 has provided that all people charged with crimes have a right to bail in all but capital cases. And capital cases used to be a kind of broad category, and fortunately we've whittled that down, and then we whittled it down to nothing. And so that meant that everyone has a constitutional right to bail. Now you would think, well, that's a great thing. Constitutional rights are good. We like those. And we like bail. Bail is a good thing also. The problem is it was a right in name only. So a judge could look at someone, a poor person, charged with a crime and say, you have a constitutional right to bail. Your bail will be set at $1 million. Now this person has no chance of making $1 million bail. I used to be a public defender and I represented lots and lots of clients held on these super high bails who couldn't get out. I also represented lots of clients held on super low bails who simply didn't have money. So in order to effectuate this bill that will make it a risk-based system, we need judges to be authorized to hold people who are the truly most risky. And that's what requires a constitutional amendment.
And this is also something when we talk about, what folks can do to help make the system better. This was a 2-year fight to get this law passed, and I know Reverend Hirschberg, you were at the State House, and many, many community groups, faith leaders, faith communities came to tell their legislators that they wanted this to pass. They wanted the opportunity to vote on it. And, time after time, it was incredibly inspiring to see the rooms at the State House filled with people from all walks of life making their voices heard, and that's so, so important. We realize not everybody can get to the State House, but picking up the phone and calling your local assembly person or senator and telling them how you feel about a particular issue, if it's bail reform or mass incarceration, and generally saying, if any bills come before you that increase penalties, we don't need any more increased penalties. That is huge. Legislators really pay attention when their constituents reach out to them, and I think people need to make their voices heard more on these issues.
We've already spoken, therefore, around some of the issues in New Jersey itself. When one thinks of mass incarceration, one tends to think of other states other than the liberal Northeast. But what exactly is the overall situation regarding mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow in New Jersey itself?
Well, if you look, I think we're better than some states in some things, but if you still look at the statistics here in New Jersey, over the last 25 years, our prison population went from about 8,000 to about 24,000. That means it tripled. The percentage of people who are incarcerated for mandatory minimums went from about 11% to 71%. And that's another piece of this, not just the number of people we put in, but how long we keep people, and spending on corrections, that is incarceration, has grown at threefold over our spending on, say, education. And when Alex talks about every dollar we're spending on mass incarceration is money we could be spending on education and other things in our communities to support our families and communities, that really goes to the heart of that. When you're spending, we went from spending about $280 million a year to spending about over $1.3 billion a year on incarceration. That's money that comes out of taxpayers' pockets and could be going to programs that they care more about.
Russia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, and Turkey have one thing in common. They all have an incarceration rate lower than New Jersey's.
Wow.
Right? In fact,
Lower than New Jersey.
Lower than New Jersey's, not than America. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the
Yes, that
country.
I know.
There is one country that has a higher rate than New Jersey's, other than the United States. That's Cuba. And so there are states that do worse than ours. But if you are one of the 37,000 people in prison or jail in New Jersey, if you know that you're 2.8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession, the fact that Alabama is worse is cold comfort.
Exactly. Very good point.
What are some of the, what is it going to take to make this go away completely? What is it going to take to solve this problem? What is it going to take in New Jersey to make mass incarceration the new Jim Crow an issue of the past? Is that too big a question for us to look at? I know there are a number of bills that your organization, Drug Policy Alliance, and the New Solutions Campaign have projected as part of your agenda to make good changes, important changes, such as your success in the Bail Reform Act. But what are some of the other ways and things that have to be done?
I mean, I think there has to be a basic shift in terms of looking, if we're talking about drug use, and looking at it as a health issue and not a criminal justice issue. And, I have some hope when you look at things right now. Our approach to the overdose crisis that we have here in New Jersey has been mostly a public health approach. And again, supported by a lot of unlikely allies. Governor Christie signed the Good Samaritan bill so people aren't arrested when they call for help in an overdose situation. He's signed the same bill which allowed for increased access to naloxone, which is the antidote to opioid overdoses, and has done a lot of work getting it into the hands of police and first responders, and there's community groups that are now providing naloxone. And so that was a public health response. We didn't say, hey, we have a situation where people are being harmed by opioids, and what do we do about it? Let's have some more penalties. Let's have some more mandatory minimums. What, at least so far, we've done is to take much more of a public health approach to it. And that's what we really need to shift this from a criminal justice perspective to a public health perspective on these issues.
I agree with Roseanne completely, but there are also things out there that are legitimate criminal justice issues. And the question is, how do we treat them? And are we treating them with a kind of a humane heart or with a cold heart? And I think part of it is kind of just recognizing the fundamental humanity in everyone who comes before the criminal justice system. And that's going to be true in our sentencing laws and everything in between. But I want to get back to this idea of the strange bedfellows, because it's not just what we've seen in New Jersey. This is happening nationally, where you've had some of the people who used to beat the drum loudest about locking people up, for whatever reason, have come and said, we need to start talking about ex-offender reentry. We need to reintegrate people coming out of prisons back into society. Now, let me be clear, that's not enough. We need to stop just focusing on reentry and stop the entry, right?
Exactly.
That's kind of
Exactly.
But it bespeaks a shifting mindset that I think is very important, and I think gives me some hope in this kind of world filled with despair, that we are at least moving in the right direction with some people finally starting to recognize, and whether it's because their heart calls them to do the right thing or their philosophy on spending calls them to do the right thing. The problem with locking up lots of people for a really long time, other than the moral problem, is that it starts to become expensive. And that's why in places where you wouldn't expect to see this, you see some of these reforms. Some of the most progressive criminal justice reforms have come from the strangest places. We do a lot of work on solitary confinement, and Maine, which has the lowest incarceration rate in the United States, has done great work on solitary confinement. But so has Mississippi. Mississippi has done really progressive things on solitary confinement. Not enough, let's be clear. In the United States, on any given day, 50,000 people wake up in solitary confinement. That fills Yankee Stadium, right? That's a horrifying thought when you think about what it means. So there's a lot of work to be done, but that gives me some hope that we're at least moving in the right direction.
I've heard some really horror stories about solitary confinement. There was an article in today's New York Times about putting juveniles in solitary confinement in Rikers Island, which is a really
Well, you don't have to travel to New York for that. That's something we've been working on. There was a group of 9 organizations that filed a petition with the Juvenile Justice Commission last July of 2013, trying to get them to end the practice of punishing children by locking them in small rooms. You would think it's kind of an elementary position, but we haven't gotten there yet in New Jersey. I think we're making some progress, but we're certainly not there yet.
And I understand that psychological studies have indicated that this is mentally very harmful and psychologically very harmful. It can have long-lasting effects to keep somebody in solitary confinement. It's a form of torture.
The brain science on it is totally clear for everyone, but particularly for vulnerable populations like juveniles or the mentally ill.
Right, yes. So I think we can conclude that something can be done because something has been done already, but there's a lot more work to do. What would you advise individuals and organizations? I know the New Solutions Campaign has a coalition put together of many organizations in New Jersey, but what can individuals and organizations do to support this effort to actually make things change?
Well, people can join the New Solutions campaign. ACLU has various campaigns. And we try and keep a lot of information on our website. Go and look. Get involved through your faith community. One of the very inspiring things that has come out of Michelle Alexander's book is that faith communities across the country have taken up reading the book and doing days of action around the book and getting involved in various criminal justice reform activities. So, those folks are out there, and you can ask, at whatever your community group is or your faith community, in your city, look for groups that are working on this and get involved, and they will know whether it's at the city level or at the state level how to get involved and what the opportunities are, depending on what your particular issue. If you're particularly passionate about solitary confinement, that is something that the ACLU has done fabulous work on. If you're particularly interested in drug policy, we both work on that issue. But everyone will have something that really grabs them, because there's so many aspects to this horrible war on drugs that, just get involved, make your voice heard, join with some other people.
Roseanne said it well, but there's no shortage of things to be done. What we need to do is convince policymakers that even though people who are incarcerated don't have an actual voice, they lose their right to vote. Very democratic, right? Even though they don't have an actual voice, there are people who are willing to speak up for them and say that this is not the society we want to live in.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'd like to say that Unitarian Universalists are the ones, actually several years ago when the book first came out, that did a national read in all our congregations on Michelle Alexander's book. And it has led us to a lot of social justice work and really trying to find more just policies. And I want to thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
The viewers should know how inspirational the two of you have been in making, especially bail reform and the new legislation that's coming out, that's being passed, a reality. It's a lot of your work and time and sweat, I know, that went into it. So we want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. I thank you for your insightful dialogue, and Al, for your wonderful moderation of really some insightful questions and helping the viewers get a better understanding of what this is all about, because they will be asked to be voting in November on
Absolutely.
this referendum, and it's really important that be passed so a lot of these issues can be rectified. So I want to thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Obviously, these issues are a little more complex than we can actually cover in a half-hour segment, but we hope, one of the things that you said was very important, is that we hope our listeners will continue to educate themselves, to become involved, read the book, get involved in communities, create coalitions of like-minded people who are concerned about these issues, and work together and talk to your congressmen and your legislators and let them know that the present system is not okay. It's very detrimental to the lives of many, many people, especially people of color. I'd like to just again say that these programs are a service of Unitarian Universalism Legislative Ministry of New Jersey. It is a nonprofit faith-based organization supported by our Unitarian Universalist congregations throughout New Jersey. If you'd like more information about this program or other advocacy projects we're working on, please go to www.UULMNJ.org. And thank you for joining us. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Hirschberg.